Good morning. So pleased to come and worship with each and every one of you today. Pleased to have the ability to worship with those virtually. There's over 32 people logged in this morning, which I would guess is 45 to 55 people out there worshiping with us with the same mind and the same spirit and the same intent. And that's something really meaningful, I think, that we have in this day. Here's the clicker. If you haven't thought about it, or I don't know what you've thought about it, the guys that work back there on that PC, that is a job. I've learned it over the last week because all 5 or 6 of them are not here this morning. You've seen a couple of repeats up here in the podium already today. With the holidays, we have a number traveling, but thank those guys. Thank Ian, who developed with David and Alex and Daniel, the YouTube streaming software. Thank Robert. I didn't know how much Robert did. Robert's probably worked an hour and a half today, and he's in Missouri. Maybe this weekend, not today. But there's certainly a lot of unseen work that goes on. And if you haven't done it, and then you have to sit back there and do it, and then try to put yourself in the right mind while you're worshiping God. And I was not thankful enough. So write them a card, tell them thank you, tell them what a great job they've done providing this for us. If you will, turn to Matthew chapter 13. We're going to spend a few minutes this morning thinking about the kingdom of heaven. The kingdom of heaven is a complicated conversation, and I don't pretend to fully have mastered that conversation. Anybody here who has, I'll go sit down and you can come up here and take my place. But we get a lot of insight in Matthew chapter 13 to what the kingdom of heaven is. Insight through parables that Jesus teaches. I think I saw a lot of these parables as lessons of ways to live and ways to be and ways to think. But I failed to put them under the umbrella of the kingdom of heaven. The kingdom of heaven is mentioned over 32 times in the book of Matthew and nowhere else in the Gospels. The kingdom itself is referred to over 40 times, either directly or indirectly in the book of Matthew. And it's a major theme that I've been too blind to see. It's been smacking me in the face, and I didn't pick up on it. And the disciples come to Jesus in Matthew chapter 13. He starts down the road with some of these parables, and they say, "Teacher, why are you teaching in these parables?" I think if you look in the Gospels of Luke, the Gospels of John, there's an element of secrecy there. He certainly says in those Gospels, only those who are in the in group will get this, and anyone outside will not understand these parables. And that was definitely desirable to Jesus at this time. He directly ordered his followers not to reveal everything he had been saying about himself at that time. But Matthew doesn't mention this secrecy. Let's take a look at this concept. Matthew, and we'll read another verse. We'll back up here in a minute, but the parables that he told was to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet. I will open my mouth in parables. I will utter what has been hidden since the foundation of the world. What is it that's been hidden? What is it that is so secretive? If you look throughout the rest of the book, or the rest of the chapter in Matthew 13, I think we can get an idea. The kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seed in his field. The kingdom of heaven is like a grain of mustard seed. Thought I fixed that typo. The kingdom of heaven is like there's another one. The kingdom of heaven is like the grains of wheat and the tares that were sown. The kingdom of heaven is like treasure that was hidden. The kingdom of heaven is like leaven that was hidden. The kingdom of heaven is like a merchant searching for a great pearl. The kingdom of heaven is like a net thrown into the sea. Sorry about the typos, but I think you get the idea from this slide. What is the secret that Jesus is trying to reveal to his disciples? Kingdom of heaven is like these things. That's what I want to take a look at this morning. The Jews of this day and age were looking for a warrior, a kingly leader, a Messiah that would come and redeem the Davidic kingdom that they had once knew. And I think we all acknowledge this fact. But it wasn't until recently I was visiting at another church, and they had a whole quarter on studying the Maccabees. And I've always knew that the Maccabees were there and what they were about. I only got to attend this one class, but that, it wasn't inspired. Maybe it really wasn't worth our time in the church to sit down and study, but it might be an interesting historical study at some point. But during this one session of this class, what came to light to me was all of the things that had happened during that, what we call the silent period, that gave so much context to the Jews who Jesus lived and worked around. And in this period of Maccabees, we see a history of the politics and the leadership and the decision-making that led to the sects, the Essenes, the Pharisees, and the Sadducees. We see these ideas of a Messiah. The leaders of that day had actually grown the borders of Judah back to the days of King David. They were ruled by a Jewish king, and they had a high priest. There was over 42 years of Jewish independence in the 170 years before Christ came to this earth. I don't think I had ever realized that. And these people had grandparents that lived during this time. Some of these people were older people who had seen some of these events take place. I think I had always been under the impression that, Jesus was maybe like throwing a hot frying pan into a bucket of cold water. And maybe there's still some truth to that statement, but they were ready for a Messiah, not because they hadn't had one in 1,200 years. They were ready because they had seen something very similar happen in very recent history. And it's easy for us to look and say, oh, well, the period of the cycle of sin, as we've learned about in Judges, and the chances they had through the kings and through the prophets and through great leaders like Nehemiah and Ezra, they had been given all their chances, and so clearly that time period was over. But to the Jews of that day, that was not at all the case. They didn't recognize those things, that this period had transpired and they should move on. They had the book of Daniel. What do we do with the book of Daniel? We try to break it down. We try to assign, well, this empire is this beast, and the stone is going to crush Rome. And that's what they were thinking about. That's what they were studying about. And they believed that there could be this man that would come and bring back the true kingdom, the kingdom of David, and they would reign there on the earth with that Messiah. I didn't fully appreciate that, because this is who Jesus was up against, right? This is who Jesus was teaching. These are the mindsets that Jesus was trying to overcome. And so we back up in Matthew chapter 13 to verse 10. We'll read through verse 15. Then the disciples came and said to him, "Why do you speak to them in parables?" And he answered them, "To you it has been given to know the secrets of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it has not been given. For to the one who has, more will be given, and he will have an abundance. But from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. This is why I speak to them in parables, because seeing they do not see, and hearing they do not hear, nor do they understand. Indeed, in their case, the prophecy of Isaiah is fulfilled that says, 'You will indeed hear, but never understand, and you will indeed see, but never perceive. For this people's heart has grown dull, and with their eyes they can barely hear, and their eyes they have closed, lest they should see with their eyes and hear with their ears and understand with their heart and turn. I would heal them. So what is this secret? What is this thing that the people are so blind to? This secret has existed from the beginning, after all. The secret is what the kingdom of heaven is like. And these people don't want to see it. They don't know to see it. If they were true observers, they would have seen that God never wanted an earthly king to begin with. And I think that may be some subcontext here that Jesus is getting at. From the beginning, this has been so. And everything you think, even my disciples, even my apostles here are not going to understand these things. And I struggled a little bit with this concept of, for the one who has, more will be given. And I think this concept to me most makes sense with, it takes a different phrase, it takes money to make money, right? You have to have a little bit of something for it to grow. You have to have a little bit of understanding in order to get to the next phase. And that's what the parables are here to do, is give us that little bit of something that we can build on. If we can get these things, then we can build on it. If we can get the milk, the baseline, then we can get to the meat. But without it, we'll never find it. And so we go back to these Jews, and if we were to write a parable for the way these Jews thought the kingdom was, I took a stab at it. You may or may not agree. This is a little speculative, but I think there's some truth in here. If I was a Pharisee and to write the parables of Matthew 13, the day before Christ came along, I might say the kingdom is like a fortress who protects those who abide within its walls and has its name. Or maybe the kingdom is like an army who destroys those who dare mock it and take a stand to abuse it. The kingdom is like a mighty cedar who displaces anything in way of its growth. The kingdom is like a banquet at which sat the mighty warriors and the noble priests of the time. Does this not encapsulate what we understand that these Jews wanted to see as the kingdom? I think so. And in a minute, we'll talk about what is our parables. What is our definition of the kingdom that we want to see? I think it's real easy for us to say, well, obviously, there's not going to be this nice castle with walls that Christ sits in. But what do we want the kingdom to be? And we'll talk about that towards the end. Let's not be too quick to judge those who didn't have it right in Christ's day. At the end of these teaching, Christ asks a question. Have you understood all these things? And we're going to talk about what all these things are. But his followers say a simple answer. Yes, we do. They get it. They say they get it. And so let's take a look and make sure we understand these parables. And I would convey to you that there are many other parables throughout Matthew that discuss the kingdom of heaven is like. And we're just going to take a sample here from Matthew 13. But I would encourage you all to do a textual study on the kingdom of heaven is like in Matthew, and it's very enlightening. The kingdom of heaven starts small and unassuming until it grows. And the first parable we see to discuss this concept is the parable of the mustard seed. Let's read that in verse 31 and 32. He put another parable before them, saying, "The kingdom of heaven is like a grain of mustard seed that a man took and sowed in his field. It is the smallest of all seeds, but when it has grown, it is larger than all the garden plants and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and make nests in its branches." What do we make of this parable? Are we impressed by the mustard seed? Do we look to it for rest and for shade in its formative state? No, we don't. But in the end, many abide in it. I think there's a lot of intention in this parable to what these Jews were expecting from the kingdom. And that it wasn't this castle, it wasn't this warrior savior. It was something far less assuming. But it would take a lot more care of them in the end. Another parable to show how the kingdom of heaven starts small is the parable of the hidden leaven in verse 33. He told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like leaven that a woman took and hid in 3 measures of flour till it was all leavened. Pretty straightforward one. The leaven didn't amount to much until you put it with the bread and it rose up, and then you had 3 great loaves to enjoy. The leaven itself was not that impressive, but investing in it sure paid off in the end. I think it's interesting that these parables teach us the kingdom is not what you are looking for. He knew the hearts of these men. He knew the hearts of his apostles. And at the end, I'm going to keep coming back to this. Have you understood all these things? His apostles, his followers said, yes, we understand. But what do we see Peter doing? He doesn't understand the death. He doesn't understand. In fact, Christ has to look at him and say, get behind me, Satan. 3 times, Christ has to convey to him that his death, his humbleness, his unassuming nature in this life will actually lead to sustenance, to life, to shade as the birds enjoyed in the mustard seed. And I mentioned to you how many times the kingdom of heaven is mentioned in Matthew chapter, and in Matthew, the whole book. We look at the Sermon on the Mount, the Beatitudes, we'll see this concept, the unassuming concept. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. 5 verse 3. In verse 10 of chapter 5, blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Do you think these things made sense to the Jew who was looking for an empire? No, this was backwards. This was upside down. And maybe part of the secrecy that Christ was able to teach through these parables, because anyone who cared about a Savior wouldn't be alarmed at these teachings, right? The kingdom of heaven is not for those who are the biggest, the baddest, the boldest, the strongest. And certainly Christ taught that here. Another element of the kingdom of heaven is for the fruitful, and not at all for those who are closely associated with it. What do I mean by that? Let's look at the parable of the net. Back to chapter 13 and verses 47 through 50. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a net that was thrown into the sea and gathered fish of every kind. When it was full, men drew it ashore and sat down and sorted the good into containers, but threw away the bad. So it will be at the end of the age. The angels will come out and separate the evil from the righteous and throw them into the fiery furnace. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. I think the Jews thought they were God's chosen people simply because of who their mother and father were. Christ is saying here, just because you're drug up in a net doesn't mean you're going to be kept. Doesn't mean you're good. You will still be weighed by your actions. Another parable that is similar is the parable of the wheat and the weeds. The one I messed up on the earlier slide. We see this in verses 24 through 30 of chapter 13. He put before them another parable before them, saying, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while his men were sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and went away. So when the plants came up and bore grain, the weeds also appeared. And the servants of the master of the house came to him and said, Master, didn't you sow good seed in your field? How then does it have weeds? He said to them, an enemy has done this. So the servants has said to him, do you want us to go and gather them? meaning the weeds. He said, no, lest in the gathering of the weeds you root up the wheat along with them. Let both grow together until the harvest. And at harvest time I will tell the reapers, gather the weeds first and bind them in bundles to be burned, but gather the wheat into my barn. Christ, further in the chapter, goes on to explain this parable, but I think it's clear, just because you live in an area, just because you have, you're associated with a field, or you got caught in the net, that's not enough. The Jews needed to know in this day and age that just because they bore the name of a Judean did not make them inheritors of the kingdom. Again, elsewhere in Matthew, we see this idea presented alongside the kingdom. In chapter 7, verse 21, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only he who does the will of my Father in heaven. A third element I think we see here is the kingdom of heaven is worth it all. The first parable is the parable of the hidden treasure. This is probably one of the more straightforward ones in the whole chapter. Matthew chapter 13, verse 44 says, the kingdom of heaven is like treasure hidden in a field, which a man found and covered up. Then in his joy he goes and sells all that he has and buys that field. He sells all that he has to buy this field and redeem this great treasure. I think sometimes it's easier for us to speculate about the ethics. Let's not get lost in those things. This treasure was worth everything this man had and everything he was able to give. Again, a few verses later, in chapter 13, verse 46, we read of the great pearl. The kingdom of heaven is like a merchant who, on finding one pearl of great value, went and sold all that he had and bought it. They weren't willing to pay the cost. They weren't willing to pay the price. They weren't even willing to pay the price of that kingdom which they identified with. We see some extreme examples of this with the rich young ruler. We might say, yeah, that's a tall ask. This man hasn't even started with the church yet, and you're asking him to sell everything that he has, and he went away sad. I can kind of identify that. But Judas sold Jesus away for 20 shekels. It's not much. These people did not understand the value of the kingdom and that it was worth everything they had and everything about themselves and everything they could give. Again, elsewhere in Matthew chapter 6, verse 33, but seek first the kingdom of and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. Seek first, seek most the kingdom. Put everything you have out there. And again, it didn't take much for us to break down, especially under the shadow of someone else's conscience, what these things meant. Have we understood these things? Have we understood all of these things? But I want to ask us, I want to ask myself, have we really understood these things? Are we looking for an unassuming kingdom? Are we at church as long as it's kosher, as long as it's glamorous to do so, as long as it's socially acceptable? Do we associate with those around us only if the world would deem them worthy? Is being a Christian and the Christian traits that come along with it attractive to the world around us? These questions should provoke us to ask, what are we really searching for here in this religion, this faith? Are we looking for a kingdom to accept those that are just associated with it? Just like the Jews, they had their name, they had their lineage, their bloodline. Many of us came from the church. Many of us have sat in services for decades. That's nothing. That's being caught in the net. Many of us come to church and sit here every Sunday and Wednesday at any time the doors are open. Not enough. That doesn't make us fruitful. That doesn't make us good fish in the net. That doesn't make us the wheat that gets put away in the barn. And I would implore you to say, what is the kingdom that you're looking for? Are you willing to associate with the humble, the unassuming, and the unattractive? Many other parables are found throughout Matthew on how to behave, how to be good, how to find what the kingdom of heaven is like. And we're not going to read all these this morning. And there's a few here that I haven't even listed, but we know about the wedding feast. The patriarch invited all of the nobles, all his friends, all his neighbors to the wedding feast. They went to their job. They went to their farm. Some even killed the servants that were sent to invite them to this feast. How bizarre is that? So the patriarch said, "Go into the streets and the byways and find anyone who's willing to come." And he filled up the wedding with those who were willing to come. And he came out to the wedding and he saw the one man did not have a wedding garment. And he threw him out into utter darkness. It's not just about accepting in this parable. It's about accepting and being prepared. These are the ways we find ourselves and the good fish in the net, so to speak. There's a parable about the debtors. Are we able to be forgiving just as we've been forgiven? The parable about the virgins who are constantly prepared, watching, waiting. It's not enough to come to the wedding gates. There's more to it than that. You can't just be caught up in the net. The kingdom of heaven is worth it all. I would argue that many of us would see these parables and agree with them. But there are so many things we identify ourselves with. There's so many things that we're concerned with in this world that we haven't given up all of it. C.S. Lewis, to paraphrase one of his statements, I'm sorry I don't have any wizard quotes for you this morning, but I do have an idea from C.S. Lewis. Yeah, that was a shot at Daniel. Sorry, Daniel, if you're watching. He said to hold on to a little bit of oneself, to preserve a little bit of oneself, is to hold on and to preserve death. And I think we like this idea of, yeah, I'm 98%, I'm 95%, I'm 90% at church, I'm involved, I'm doing good works, I'm doing good things, but my 5% extra for myself is not really sinful. But that's not what we're called for here. And I think C.S. Lewis's point is clear. That 5% is 5% death, and why would we want to hold on to that in our lives? Christ explains the parable of the wheat and the weeds, the wheat and the tares, in verses 24 through 30. Let's read that real quick. He put another parable before them, saying, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while his men were sleeping, his enemy came." That's just the parable. I'm sorry. Verse 36. Then he left the crowds and went into his house, and his disciples came to him saying, "Explain to us the parable of the weeds of the field." He answered, "The one who sows the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world, and the good seed is the sons of the kingdom. The weeds are the son of the evil one, and the enemy who sowed them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age, and the reapers are angels. Just as the weeds are gathered and burned with the fire, so will it be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send his angels, and they will gather out his kingdom, all causes of sin and all lawbreakers, and throw them into the fiery furnace. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. He who has ears, let him hear. These parables were nonsensical to those who did not understand, but we have the benefit of the written text here. And with so much focus on the kingdom that Matthew provides, I think we would be wise to spend some time dwelling on this. These parables were nonsensical to those who did not understand. They defied logic. They defied common sense. They defied human understanding on so many levels. Jesus taught about how to treat your enemies. How many people on this planet think like Jesus did about their enemies? Jesus taught about amassing worldly goods and the folly of that. How many people think so differently? How many of us think so differently on that concept? Jesus taught on divorce. His disciples said, "This is a hard thing you've said to us." Yeah, it is. These things are hard. These things are complicated. These things are non-intuitive. Jesus taught about his death and what that would mean. His disciples made them anxious. They did not understand. It's so interesting to me that Jesus doesn't call them out here. But he says, "Have you understood all these things?" And they say, "Yes." And Matthew spends the rest of his gospel talking about how they did not understand these things. And all that is, to me, is a message of how careful we each have to take this concept in to try to understand. Are we looking for a kingdom that is unassuming, that is for the fruitful, and that is worth everything we have and we are? This is a hard teaching. Just like I tried to attempt to write the parable for the Jews of that day, I tried to write a parable for myself. I think if I could put religion into my preference, I would look at the prayer of Jabez. Not for the reasons you might think, but the Jews' parable was not necessarily unscripturally based. The kingdom of David was something great and glorified. There was biblical basis there, and I think many of us probably have our kingdom with some level of biblical basis, but that doesn't make it full, and it doesn't make it right. It doesn't make it what Christ taught. The prayer of Jabez says, "Oh, that you would bless me indeed and enlarge my territory, that you would keep your hand from me and keep my heart from evil, so that I would not cause anyone pain." I think there's a context there. If you understand his name was born in much pain. Jabez wasn't asking for greed or glory. He was asking because he did not want to make anyone else have to suffer on his behalf. That's probably a very noble cause. I want to go and work hard, make some money, take care of my family, enjoy my kids. Don't cause any trouble. Don't cause anyone pain. And live a quiet life. If I were to write the parable, it might look like an employer. The kingdom of John is like, and please, this is not the teaching, this is my own vulnerable failure. The kingdom of John is like an employer who employed many men who worked hard, were non-political, and kept to themselves. And they all made a little money, they all saved for retirement, and lived well into their old age with their family and their loved ones. And I don't just say that because that's what we all prefer our life to be like, but put that on a spiritual level. That's what I would like the kingdom to be like. But that's not what we're called for here. That's not what Matthew chapter 13 says the kingdom of heaven is like. It costs us everything. And until I'm willing to accept that, I don't know what kind of fish I am in the net. Until I'm willing to accept the unattractive nature that the world will see the kingdom as, I don't know if I'm the wheat or the tare. We need to spend these things seem basic in a 5-minute study, but when we dwell on them, they're vital to our understanding of our salvation. So I would encourage you with that. Take some time this week, this next year, and ask yourself, do you understand what the kingdom of heaven is? Read Matthew with this subcontext of, I need to understand what the kingdom of heaven is. And if I have that part of myself I'm holding on to, I need to recognize that as holding on to death. So many times we come here this morning and extend an invitation to come forward. Certainly we'll do that this morning. But I'm extending an invitation into your heart. Spend time this week and write your own parable. I'm going to pick on Steve, who's away from us this morning. The parable of Steve Garrett is like. The parable of Tosin is like. The kingdom of Tosin is like. The king of Justin is like. King of Christie is like. I don't mean to pick on any one person, but we all need to write this parable and see if it aligns with Matthew chapter 13. That's my invitation to you this morning. Let's align ourselves, our own parable of the kingdom, with Matthew chapter 13. If you have sin in your life, if you have pain, if you're exhausted, David mentioned this is the last service of 2020. Many people are exhausted. I'll tell you, Jesus' followers were exhausted. I'm tired. I get it. We're here to support you. We're your brothers and sisters. Whoever you are, wherever you come from, we want to support you. And if you can't bring yourself to come forward this morning to ask for help, please ask me. Please ask one of the elders. Please reach out to Daniel or Steve. There's so many people here willing to stand by you, to hold you up, and to push you forward as we try to seek out this kingdom. If you've never started that walk, the Bible teaches, this isn't me saying this isn't my opinion or what I want. The Bible teaches you need to be baptized to be saved. And we do not shy away from that fact here. We're happy to do that now in front of the congregation. But don't put it off. If you don't want a crowd, we can accommodate that too. But come forward and start your walk seeking this kingdom. It's worth everything you have and everything you are. Please come forward while we stand and sing.